2013, I got a call from a donor named Karen. She was like, I want to give you guys $50. I'd started DigDeep at the time. We were working in South Sudan and in Cameroon, building water systems. Really, really great work. She's like, I want to give you $50 and I want you to spend it in the US. And I was like, lady, come on. Like, why don't you let me spend the money where it's really needed? This is the richest country on earth. And she's like, I can't believe you're supposed to be an expert on this and you don't know. You know that there are people in this country who don't have any access to water. And she had been doing a Habitat for Humanity style project on the Navajo Nation, the country's largest reservation. And they were building houses without bathrooms and kitchens. And she was like, what the hell? And her colleagues were like, yeah, I mean, there's no running water in this town, so why would we build those?
Hello, friends. I'm Nick Laparra, and this is the Let's Give a Damn podcast, the show you listen to when you want to hear from people who are giving a damn and making the world a much better place in so many unique and meaningful ways. Thank you for hitting play. Thank you for showing up this week. And most of all, thank you for joining us on this journey toward leaving the planet much better than we found it. I gotta say, friends, I feel good this morning. I got up early, walked to my voting location, and voted in the New York primary. Now, I know these primaries are happening at all different times all over the country. Some have already happened, some have yet to happen. Today, it's happening here in New York, in Florida, and in Oklahoma. Next month, it's happening in Delaware, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. As the November midterms inch closer and closer, it is important, it is incredibly important for each one of you, each one of us, to make our voice heard and our voices collectively heard. Voting is so fucking important. It really, really is. I know it can feel discouraging when we look at our political landscape, but the way that we change that is by voting every single chance we can, and for many of us to run for office, one of the 500,000 offices that you can run for in this country. So during these days and leading up to November, research your candidates. Please do the homework. Make sure you know who is for what they think about the things that are important to you and your neighbors and the other people around you. Have a plan for how you'll vote. Talk with your boss about taking off work if needed. But please be prepared. These upcoming elections are so vital for the future of democracy in this country. And I always, when I say these things about our political landscape, what's happening here in the US, I recognize that there are people from all over the world listening to this podcast. But I also recognize that most of the listeners are here in this country. So forgive me, our global friends, every once in a while, I need to say these things, I need to share these things, and this really applies for everybody as well. Everyone should be voting and getting involved politically. We just have some very interesting and vital, incredibly important elections coming up here in this country. So vote, vote, vote. One more thing before I introduce my incredible guest to you today. Some news. Frederick Buechner died last week. A very sad day for so many, myself included. If you don't know who Buechner is, who I'm talking about, I implore you to change that today. Google is your friend. Buechner was a poet, essayist, preacher, theologian, and author of, if my numbers are correct, 14 fiction books and 13 nonfiction books. But don't be put off by me describing him as a preacher or a theologian. The New York Times described him as a novelist with a religious bent. He was known as a theologian and as a preacher who never was a pastor. He never had a congregation. He was known as someone who asked the questions, doubted, leaned into the mystery of everything. In fact, I highly recommend you read that New York Times article written the day he died, August 15. So go look for it. And I bring up Buechner's death for lots of reasons, but I want to share two quotes of his that I've been thinking about this past week since he died. I want to share those quotes with you, and you'll see why. They're incredibly important, they're incredibly powerful and inspiring, and they also apply to us, the Let's Give a Damn community. First one, quote, "Whatever you do with your life, whatever you end up achieving or not achieving, the great gift you have in you to give to the world is the gift of who you alone are. Your way of seeing things, and saying things and feeling about things. That is like nobody else. If so much as a single one of you were missing, there would be an empty space at the great feast of life that nobody else in all creation could fill. End quote. That quote has always made me feel pretty much all of the things. And it has empowered me to speak up and speak out and to try to figure out who I alone am. Because there's only one Nick Laparra, and there's only one Buechner, and there's only one you. And the second quote, one life on this earth is all that we get. Whether it is enough or not enough, and the obvious conclusion would seem to be that at the very least, we are fools if we do not live it as fully and as bravely and as beautifully as we can. These quotes tell me that Buechner would have been very glad to be part of the Let's Give a Damn community and would have fit in very well in the Let's Give a Damn community. And that makes me happy. Makes me happy that we're building something that someone like Buechner could partake in, realize the messiness of life, and want to make change alongside with us. So remember this, friends, that at the very least, we are fools if we do not live it as fully and bravely and beautifully as we can. Okay, now for my guest this week. You are in for a treat. George McGraw is an absolutely delightful human that has been giving a damn for the better part of his life, and especially over the past 10 years. Very meaningful ways. George McGraw is a leading expert on water and sanitation in the U.S. and around the world. He currently serves as the founder and CEO of DigDeep, the only WASH means water, sanitation, and hygiene, the only WASH organization solely focused on the United States. George is a leading queer voice in social change, entrepreneurship, and environmental justice. He is an Ashoka Fellow, a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, and former social entrepreneur in residence at Stanford University. This conversation made me incredibly sad that millions of Americans, America, the wealthiest and most prosperous country on the planet, made me sad that millions of Americans living in this country don't have running hot or cold water or toilets or showers in their homes. And this lack of water affects their lives in so many seen and unseen ways. It's tragic. But while I am and was sad at this reality, was being during our conversation and still am right now thinking about it, I have so much hope that we can end this crisis because people like George and organizations like DigDeep are doing this good and hard work. So get ready. This is a fantastic conversation. I found it super helpful. I hope you will as well. Now, before we dive into this conversation, a quick reminder, as always, that you can email me anytime and for any reason at hello@letsgiveadamn.com. You can ask questions, recommend future guests, tell me how much you love or hate the show. Anything goes. I just love hearing from you. hello@letsgiveadamn.com. And now, let's get right into my conversation with my new friend and fellow damn giver, George McGraw. Let's go. It's a pleasure to have you on the Let's Give a Damn podcast, George. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Nick. What's up?
What's up is a lot. A lot's up. I know for you, and for me. We've got a lot going on. We are busy people trying to give a damn. If you're not
busy, you're dead. Yeah,
I completely agree. And we were talking before we hit record that more times than not lately, it seems like I am having to reschedule or postpone, whether it's my fault or somebody else needs to reschedule. It's taken a couple times for us to get this on the calendar, because I was originally approached by your team about this June 28 thing that we're going to talk about that you all released on June 28. That came and went. And here we are in August. Obviously, the things that you wrote, the research that you release is still very relevant today. So no harm done there. But it's been a couple months of us trying to get this together. So glad you're here. We've got so much to dive into over the next hour. So let's get right to it. I always love to begin conversations. There's so many great interviewers out there that begin and they get right into the matter at hand. Water, in this case. Like, let's talk water. For me, that's not interesting because Let's Give a Damn is all about the individuals. Like, yes, there's a lot of people working on water. There's a lot of people working on water here, abroad, so on and so forth. But your story is unique. And so I always love to start with some story. I always love to figure out who George McGraw is, where George came from, how this whole thing came together. And so I'd love to spend, maybe the first third of our conversation talking about the people, places, and things that shaped you, the things that ultimately led to you getting into addressing the incredible need of water, not abroad, not in Africa, not in South America, right here in our own backyard, a place that most people, I would imagine, wouldn't even think that was an issue, right? And yet millions and millions of people need it so desperately. And so let's start there. Go back as far as you want to. I won't tell you to start, when you're whatever, from when you were born. You start wherever you want to. But give us some of the people, places, and things that made George into who George is today.
Oh, man. Okay. So I think this is a great way to start this conversation, first of all, because it usually is like, just digging into the problem right away. And it's like, what is the context? And I recently had a chance to think a lot about this. I joined an organization called Ashoka as a fellow, and they really dig into like, what is your journey as a social entrepreneur? And like, why did that lemonade stand or that, violent incident or that place you were born, like, how did that have an impact on you? And I think, that was the first time I was really confronted with that question, and I'm happy to hear it again. I think for me, my answer to that question has been about hospitality. I grew up as a closeted queer kid in like not a very open and accepting environment, like very religious, conservative, loving, certainly, and I have a great relationship with my family, but tough environment, and spent most of my life in the closet. And always really yearned, I think, for like a home that was more accepting, more open, more nurturing. And I think it's my life's work, my like vocation to help other people experience that in their home. And for me, that has meant working in water and sanitation, helping people get the running water and the working toilets and the taps and the sinks that they need to live like healthy, happy lives, to be truly human inside their houses. Something I really craved.
I love the approach there. I don't love that you had to go through some really hard times to get these realizations about what you wanted to do in life. But at the same time, knowing what I know about you, what I've read about you, what I've listened to so far, even before our conversation, I don't think you would probably take any of that back, any of the hard times, because it made you who you are today, right? Talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, because I still dip my toes in the faith religion arena still. I have not left it. But what I experience now in terms of God in my faith couldn't be more different than what I experienced growing up. So could you talk a bit more about, what that environment was, and did you have any, and I don't want to spend a ton of time here, but did you have any, it wasn't a very accepting environment, which forced you to stay in the closet for a long time. But were there any people around you that were safe spaces for you, even in the midst of a bunch of people and institutions that wouldn't accept you as you were and are?
Man, yes, absolutely yes. And you're right. I wouldn't change it for an instant. I think that that pressure, that crucible that a lot of queer people go through, that coming out process, that like spending time with yourself and coming to terms with who you are and what you want, and the fact that that's a journey, and then presenting that to other people and leaving yourself vulnerable to their feedback, especially people that are so important to you. I think that is kind of like an alchemy or a magic that makes queer people so powerful as friends, as listeners, as problem solvers. Like, that's our superpower. And of course, like, I want a world in which people don't have to come out anymore and like they don't face that adversity. But for now, like, there's definitely some beauty to that. And I think for me, that's what religion has been too. Like, I still, I'm very spiritual. I'm also deeply religious. I'm a member of a community, an Episcopal community here in Los Angeles called All Saints. That is, I think, like, truly the best of Christianity. I remember going to the church the first time, and it was during the beginning of the Syrian war, that's still going on now. And I remember the sort of priests, black, white, female, male, queer, on the altar saying, like, we're moving out of the residence so that we can accept some Syrian refugee families to come live here. And I was like, wow. Whoa, like that's what it means. Like, that's what the point is. So yeah, a very different system, but not so different than the one I grew up in. And I did find, like, I grew up in a very conservative Roman Catholic household, and there is that beauty to the system, despite the difficult that the institutionalization and sort of empire has brought to this otherwise very progressive message of human connection and love and dignity. And I think that there are these people, even inside those institutions, who are striving for good and doing incredible things. I remember
absolutely
was struggling with my own sexual identity, and like, that's so core to who you are as a human. And I remember going to confession, like so many Catholics do, so many times, just like riddled with guilt. And in my 20s, I went to a church, a parish here in Los Angeles, and a Franciscan friar heard my confession, and he was just like so stunned that I was so upset and was struggling with this so much. And he's like, will you come around the screen and like sit with me and let me help you? And we began a friendship, and we'd see each other for years, once a week, once every 2 weeks. And he really helped me, come out to my family and approach myself with honesty, and understood that there's a place for me in this world that is, I don't know, safe and dignified. And so I'm really grateful for that.
I love that a Franciscan friar working within a religious system that, overall, again, there are particular people and groups within it that are very accepting and very welcoming, but overall, his authority, the authority figures are saying, don't promote that, don't foster that. And yet he said, he embraced you and brought you into his friendship circle and helped you ultimately come out. I love that.
I remember in that conversation early on, him being like, it's Christmas and you're being, dishonest with yourself and dishonest with others, and I want you to come out by Easter. And he's like, I'll put on my clerks and fly home with you if you need me to. Yeah, it was incredible.
That's amazing. That's true friendship, though. And as much harm as the Catholic Church and other groups like it, large groups like it, have harmed so many people, I'm so blessed to know people like your Franciscan friar friend here, even here in New York City. My friend, Father James Martin, who has been a fierce advocate for
right. We love Martin.
Yeah, LGBTQ people within the Catholic Church, and has helped. And there's so many others. There are LGBTQ flag flying Catholic parishes here in New York City, right? I mean, they're clearly defying what their church says, and they're not making any excuses for it. They're just doing it. I saw that you are currently serving as a Stanford University social entrepreneur in residence, and I'm starting a similar residence at Middle Church here in New York. I'm not sure if you've heard of Middle Church.
I have.
Dr. Jackie Lewis, they just asked me to sort of be their first entrepreneur in residence. And I'm so excited because a church like that is a church that I'm not embarrassed at all. I'm not embarrassed by my faith. I'm not embarrassed by how I feel about God and what I think is happening in the world. But a lot of churches, I'm embarrassed. I would be embarrassed to talk about my association with them. And Middle Church is a church that I'm like, no, I'm not fearful that Ben, one of the queer pastors there, or Jackie Lewis or others, I'm not fearful they're going to say anything or do anything in this city and beyond that I would have to, because they are a very welcoming and accepting environment. And again, it lines up. That's what I think our faith and what God is trying to do anyway in the world is bring more people in, not make the group smaller that gets in and everybody else, fuck you. Like sorry, you
Yeah.
didn't get in.
Imagine.
You didn't get in.
Yeah, what kind of God is it? I struggle. Like I'm not on this maybe as easy, or I don't have as much ease with it as maybe you do. I still have trouble talking about the fact that I practice a religion or that I have a faith. It's not just sort of like an amorphous spirituality, especially in my queer community where so many people have been hurt for so long by these religious systems that have been built to oppress them and suppress them and continue to do it in like new and surprising and especially torturous ways, even today. And I think, for queer people, in many cases, like there's this moment where you can either reconcile yourself to it and accept it and let it destroy part of you, or you can completely reject it. And, maybe that part of you that did identify with it or love it also gets destroyed. Or there's this middle ground that I think is hard to find. But if you're lucky enough to have people in your life like that friar, for me, for instance, they can kind of midwife it for you. You can come to a more mature understanding that, that religion, belief, spirituality isn't about a system. It's about, for me, it's about a way of being and thinking in the world that acknowledges that everything is paradox and that two things can be true at the same time. And the work to reconcile that in yourself and to see the world and your purpose as more than just this black and white thing, like that's the work. And I found a faith system and tradition that like helps me do that. And some people have other things that help them do that too, outside of those systems.
Yeah, I have found that in the Episcopalian Church as well. I'm Episcopalian. I will now be serving as entrepreneur in residence at a United Church of Christ church, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I for years have been searching for, listen, no faith tradition is going to be perfect. I'm going to have issues with each and every one of them, but which one causes the least amount of harm, in my opinion? Because that's all I'm trying to do in the world. I'm going to cause harm. We are all causing harm. How can we cause the least amount of harm? And so in my faith, that applies as well. Like I love the Catholic tradition. I've thought about converting to Catholicism 1,000 times, but I can't at this point because now if I was born Catholic, I could see maybe there's a path where I'd still stay in, but I can't convert to it as long as women can't lead in the church, and as long as they continue to harm so many different kinds of people, right? But Episcopalian, it's like, okay, I know there's some weird stuff sometimes, and not everything is great, but I think the most amount of people are being invited in. And so, and I would never presume, we can move on after this, but I would never presume to tell you, that you should feel more comfortable talking about it, because all of our journeys are different, and I 1,000% understand why. The one thing that's helped me become more comfortable with just talking about it, and even identifying with something, it honestly happened in 2 years into the Trump presidency, when more and more things were happening, like more and more fucked up things were happening in the name of God, Jesus, the church, Christian nationalism, that I literally had a crisis of faith, and I was like, okay, either I leave it all right now, because I do not want to identify with those people. Those are not my people. Or I realize that there's actually something here, that they're serving such a distorted view of what God, this really big love being wants to do in the world, that I can't let them like if I leave, George, if you and I leave, then they have a little bit more of the pie, right? They have a bigger percentage of like Christian nationalists and the weirdos that like are reading the Bible word for word and are oppressing people with it. Well, they get a bigger piece of the pie. More people are going to think of them when they hear about Christians, right? So anyway, that was the one thing that kept me in, was I was like, listen, I cannot let Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert and Donald Trump, and Jim Jordan, and all of these wild fill in the blanks. I can't let them have a faith that I still think is like, I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know I have very few answers these days, which is a really great thing. But like, I think it's something, so they don't get it. So that's why I stayed in, because I was ready to leave, man. I was ready to go. I was like, Donald Trump's a Christian and I'm a Christian. No, one of us is not a Christian, and it might be me leaving. So anyway, that's where we are right now.
I'm taking up that space. Yeah, good for you. I think the same thing. There's just the thing that really resonated with me and all that is just like, there's just so much I don't know. And like, I think that's the difference between those two approaches. Is one is about the mystery and the humility, and the other is about, the absolute certainty of good and wrong and black and white. And, there is so much more gradation than that.
Yeah, completely agree. Okay, let's inch forward in this conversation. I want to talk about how did you, before we get to DigDeep, what DigDeep is, what DigDeep does, what was the genesis there for you? Like, how did it come about? I know you said that you're trying to figure out all these things, and water was, a meaningful thing, but like, maybe get a little more specific and talk about what was the thing that made you decide, hey, water's my thing, at least for the foreseeable future. You could change your career at some point, but like, water's the thing. There's a big problem here to be solved, and I'm one of the people that's going to get to do it because I'm ready to do this. How did that happen? Yeah. And kind of what age too? Like, how long ago was this?
Well, in the hundreds of interviews I must have given since I started DigDeep, I've never come across inside my own psyche a crystal clear answer to this question.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's a circuitous path. It's crazy where you end up in life sometimes, never really anticipating it. I can say for certain a couple of things. One, I have always been obsessed with water. Call it the fact that I'm a triple water sign, or that I grew up near water, or what, but I'm like the kid that your mom would take you to the zoo, and like, she'd go buy the tickets and she'd turn around and I'd be like stripped naked playing in the fountain at the entrance. Like, I can't get enough.
Amazing.
But I think the other irony in all this is that I was raised in such a sheltered way, that I didn't understand that there were so many hundreds of millions, even billions of people struggling to get access to the resource until college. And then in this period of like deeply trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted to do and what impact I wanted to have, I was confronted with that reality and that question, and something about it like settled in me, or rather unsettled me. And ever since then, I haven't quite been able to shake it. And through that process, like, my career has had different aspects. I mean, I started studying law, and I thought maybe I'll work in diplomacy or at the UN, and then, kept getting sort of closer and closer to the work on the ground in other countries where I thought, well, if you want to work on this issue, you have to work in another country, right? You have to work in like a low income country halfway around the world. And then in 2013, I got a call from a donor named Karen. She was like, I want to give you guys $50. I'd started DigDeep at the time. We were working in South Sudan and in Cameroon, building water systems. Really, really great work. She's like, I want to give you $50 and I want you to spend it in the US. And I was like, lady, come on. Like, why don't you let me spend the money where it's really needed? This is the richest country on earth. And she's like, I can't believe you're supposed to be an expert on this and you don't know, that there are people in this country who don't have any access to water. And she had been doing a Habitat for Humanity style project on the Navajo Nation, the country's largest reservation. And they were building houses without bathrooms and kitchens. And she was like, what the hell? And her colleagues were like, yeah, I mean, there's no running water in this town, so why would we build those? And so that kicked off this journey, what would later become the Navajo Water Project, our first project in the US. And by 2016, we had successfully handed our international work off to local partners. And now we're the only organization really focused on this problem, which I'm realizing now we haven't even talked about yet. But that's been the journey. I think, like, not a clear direction, not a clear through line, a lot of openness to circumstance, a lot of curiosity, and this one sort of unsettling thought at the pit of my stomach, which is just like, I love this resource, this thing. It means so much to me. I feel so connected to it. How could people live without it?
It might be helpful for you to, I think most people, or a good chunk of the people listening, already know what being a WASH organization is, but maybe let's start there. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but describe what being the only WASH organization that's specifically focused. And I think that actually it's very telling about all kinds of amazing, smart people like yourself in 2013 before you got that phone call, right? That when we think of water, yes, we might put some money and resources here in the U.S., if it's a U.S.-based organization. But most of the time we're thinking, no, we've got to take this to all these other places and countries, which that is worthy work as well. I'm not saying that's bad. But to me, it's so telling that DigDeep is the only WASH organization specifically focused on the U.S., right? So describe what it is.
Yeah, so WASH is an acronym. I can't believe I used an acronym without even noticing. Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene. And, it is the work that helps people get access to the clean water they need to live like a healthy, dignified life. Everything from cooking, cleaning, drinking, bathing, maintaining a clean home, freedom from disease, the time you get back to play with your kids or to go to work. It's, water really is like the foundation of our lives, the thing that many of us in the US take for granted. And most people, when they think of places without water, think of sub-Saharan Africa. And like, in my mind's eye, I can see the army of young people like me getting on planes and going to work on these issues abroad. But in fact, right here in the US, the richest democracy on earth, we have 2.2 million people at least and growing who have literally no access to running water at all at home, who leave their house every day and if they're lucky, drive miles to buy bottled water and use that for everything. Or maybe, take a shower at a truck stop or at school or pull water out of a mine shaft or a creek and boil it on the stove before they wash their hair and drink it and cook. And it's really crazy. I think, in the US, this is happening in all 50 states. It's got a race component to it. Indigenous folks are 19 times more likely than white families not to have running water. Black and Latino families are twice as likely. Like so many things in the US, it has a history of racism at the core of the problem. And the problem's growing. Maybe for the first time in US history, climate change and economic shifts are putting more pressure on old systems that are falling offline and people are losing the access they once had. And so instead of going down, that number's going up.
I want to reiterate numbers that you just said that I think are just mind-blowing. Let's start with the Black and Latinx households are twice as likely than white households to lack indoor plumbing. And then that jumps to 19 times for Native Americans. Mm-hmm. I have many amazing friends that are Native American and that are not Native American that work with Native Americans on reservations all over. One of my favorite people in the world and good friends, Charles Robinson, he and his family started Red Road, an amazing organization, and he and his wife are both Native American, two different tribes. She's from British Columbia and he's from Birmingham or somewhere in Alabama. Anyway, they're amazing. So that tons of work, and I've as someone who is socially conscious and someone who, like you, we spend most of our time thinking about how to tell better stories and solve problems and get more people to give a damn. What we have put our Native American siblings through and what they, not just what we did, right, hundreds of years ago and a couple hundred years ago and 100 years ago and 50 years ago, but what they still go through. Like the owners of this land have been so mistreated that there are 2.2 million people that lack, 2.2 million people in arguably the wealthiest country on the planet, still don't have running water. And because of the numbers, I'm not going to do math right now, but maybe you could get more specific. But like because of the numbers you just shared, most of those are Native Americans that lack this life-altering and life-giving thing. Like I can't imagine living without water. Like I use water from the moment I get up and I chug a bunch of cold water and then put water on for my first cup of coffee. And then the last thing I do every night is chug another glass of water, right? And all day long, I'm turning faucets on, I don't waste, but like I'm, faucets and a quick shower and this and that. Like, that's so wild to me that in this country, 2.2 million people, most of them being Native Americans.
Yeah, it is wild. I think, well, to your point, you can't imagine it. Like I used to struggle with, I still struggle with that sometimes too. Like I see this work every day. I interact with it on the ground. I'm there often in that first moment when someone turns on a tap for maybe the first time in their lives. Um, which is just wild. We could have a whole
Wild.
hour just about what that looks like. Especially when, maybe you have a TV at home and a cell phone and live down the street from Taco Bell. But I digress. I think the imagination of it is really powerful, right? Because you have the average American who uses 100 gallons or more of water per day. And then you have one of
Wow.
our clients who often uses less than a gallon. And the irony is that the people that have the most water have the least connection to it. And the people that have the least water have the deepest connection to it. And connection just in the sense of it's scarce and it's precious and they know that, but also in many cases, like a deep cultural, spiritual connection to it, as in the case of most of the tribes we work with. And DigDeep's work is about facilitating an exchange between those two groups of people. For those that are well-resourced and have access to water, it's often in the form of money or attention or, policy pressure or whatever. And on the side of folks without any access to water, it's often this sort of this knowledge, this attitude, this love of water that we're trying to facilitate a transfer of. And, we have programs obviously that like build infrastructure and that build, put in taps and toilets and do job training and policy advocacy. But I think honestly, one of the most powerful things that we have when it comes to imagination is this 4 liters challenge at work where, you try to live for 24 hours on just 4 liters of water, which, the World Health Organization says is the minimum amount you need. And like you fill up your liter Nalgene or whatever. And it's like every time you want to use water for 24 hours to brush your teeth or to clean your pits or to make some ramen or whatever, to drink, certainly you have to drink like, 2/3 of it. It comes out of that bottle and to plan your day, maybe for the first time in your life around how much water you have, which is, many of our clients wake up every morning and their first thought isn't like, oh my God, that presentation at work, or like, shit, I gotta drive my kids carpool or whatever. It's like, how will I get enough clean water for my family and I to make it through the day? And what does that mean about what I can do and not do and buy and how much time I have? And that experience is so different and yet it's so present. It's in all 50 states. And I think I'll stop there for a second. I'm going on and on, but I get really into this.
No, this is good. This is so good. So this 4 liter challenge that you just mentioned, that's interesting to me. That's something that I will be doing very soon.
Good,
because
you should.
I think
it's online.
Yeah. So that was my next question is in the show notes, when we share this episode, I'm going to link to it because I want people to do that as well. So it's not so hard. I grew up in Guatemala. I've traveled the world. I've seen people, not in the US, because I think that's different. That's a different thing happening here. But I've seen people turn on a tap for the very first time in Zambia, Africa, in Hyderabad, India. Like I've seen that happen. And it's a mind-blowing thing for someone to see running water for the first time. But not here. That's different. That's the wild thing about this conversation is that we're not talking about sub-Saharan Africa. God bless those amazing people. We're talking about those living right next door to us in the richest country in the world. So I want to shift for 1 second and ask, we're going to get into exactly how DigDeep does this work, and I want to talk, and I know you're addressing parts of it all the way through, but I want to talk about this June 28 paper that was put out and the significance of it. But I want to talk about our government's role in all this right now, real quickly. Do you have a number? If I were to say, hey, George, I've got a blank check for you. What would it take to not only get water to those 2.2 million people, that not just physical water, but like the infrastructure so they can keep having water, but to make sure that no one suffers from lack of water in this country? Like, what would that cost? What are we looking at? I mean, even a rough estimate for like, man, if I could write a blank check to DigDeep, because our government certainly isn't doing it. We'll get to that in a second. But like, what would that cost?
Well, we have some estimates now of what it would take to close that water gap in the U.S. Now, the bigger question is what's it going to take to keep it from widening?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think we know
because I saw a statistic, and maybe this is where you're going. It said number of households without water recently increased in Delaware, Kansas, New Hampshire, Idaho, Nevada, South Dakota, Puerto Rico, which is mind-blowing to me that in 2022, we're talking about this gap not narrowing, but widening.
Yeah, I mean, and that's climate change and that's economic shifts. I mean, we're working in Appalachia on the Appalachia Water Project now, which serves folks in rural West Virginia and Kentucky. Many people think of those folks as being white, when in fact these counties are some of the most racially diverse in that region, and a lot of our clients are Black. And these are former, coal mining communities who have been sort of economically decimated by the very necessary shift in energy policy in the U.S. But that's meant that the water systems they once relied on that were maintained by those coal companies have fallen offline. And, families that used to have running water haven't had it in 20, 30, 50 years. In other places like in Alaska Native villages, water systems once worked, and now with climate change and changes in the permafrost and seawater incursion, like the groundwater can no longer be drank. And so those systems are falling offline. So this is increasing. I think, to get back to your question, it's going to cost us between $40 and $50 billion to close the water gap for the 2.2 million Americans that need service. And that is a government investment that needs to be made, because when you look at the economics, economists would call this a wrong pockets problem. We know that for every dollar we invest in giving someone a tap or a toilet, we get $5 back. But those benefits don't accrue to like one shareholder. So there's no economic incentive for a private company to say, build a water system in rural New Mexico to serve Navajo families, because they're never going to recoup their investment. They're never going to make any money. And we've relied on private companies and municipal water systems borrowing government money that they usually have to pay back to solve this problem. And Those models aren't going to work. Those models aren't going to work. They haven't worked. The number's growing. It's proof. So 40, 50 billion upfront, or 40, 50 billion over 50 years to solve that problem. Only 11 or 12 upfront, which is less than the US spends on ice cream every year. It's also that big investment is less than we just decided to spend last week or the week before on shoring up microchip manufacturing in the US. It's like, this is not a lot of money. But the bigger question, and the one I don't have an answer for, is what's it going to take to keep our water systems functioning and resilient in the face of climate change? I think the American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated that we need at least $1 or $2 trillion in investment to keep our current system running. And so that's a much bigger question. But above my pay grade, maybe.
No, sure. And that's a question that I wasn't even thinking about. Obviously, I know that there's long-term money here. You said initially 10 or 11 billion, and then 40, 50 and whatever, and then bigger amounts and bigger ideas. Why, though, is federal funding for water only 14% of what it was 50 years ago? What's that about? Not even 50, like 40-something years ago.
It's even less. I think it's only 9% of what it was in 1977 in terms of like the federal share. Well, it's about economic liberalization. I think in the 1930s, we decided to invest massive amounts of money in this nation's infrastructure. And the idea was to create a better life for people. We knew we could, by building a water system, we could eliminate cholera. We could improve economic and working conditions, especially in rural agricultural parts of the country. We could boost the development of the nation. And unfortunately, those programs, as effective as they were at extending water access to more than 90%, 99% of people in the US, they always had a flaw at the heart of them, which is they weren't designed to meet everybody. The reason that Native Americans are 19 times more likely than white families not to have running water is because those systems were designed to pass them right by. And because the US continues to just live this legacy of broken treaty promises. And you mentioned violence perpetrated 50, 100 years ago. Like, this violence is being perpetrated now on Native populations. And that's a whole nother road we could go down. I'm not Indigenous myself, but I work really closely with a lot of Indigenous folks, including our Navajo Water Project director here at work. And this is something she's super passionate about. But we were building this infrastructure. It was never meant to serve everybody. It clearly doesn't serve everybody. But in the late 70s, during the Reagan-Thatcher era, this wonderful idea of economic liberalization came along, and it's not the worst thing that's ever happened. But the idea was, we moved some of our social services and public benefits from government investments to private industry, thinking like the market, right? That the magic of the market could extend these services faster and more efficiently. And for water, at least, and for many other public services that have a human rights component to it, we've proven that's not going to work. There is no market incentive to serve the last mile. And so if you leave it to the market, it'll never get done. And in fact, now we see this problem is growing. So, liberalization is the reason that government investment went from, more than 70% down to less than 9 today. And it's the cliff we're trying to climb back up from.
So how does, and again, these are things that you've mentioned a few times during our conversation, but how does it work? How does DigDeep work? You're working on various, projects on the Navajo Reserve. Now you're doing stuff in Appalachia. So let's just say, I guess one of the more recent projects is Appalachia. Is that accurate from what I was looking at?
Yeah, Appalachia's recent. We just launched into the Texas colonias, the sort of border communities along the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas.
Amazing.
I think that's our newest work.
Yeah, so since that's the newest one, how is it working these days? What exactly is happening? Because a lot of people listening, they know about Charity Water, they know about, all these different organizations doing this work. What you all do is not unlike what they do, but you obviously have your own way of doing things and how you approach it. So what is currently happening as you're starting up that project right now?
Yeah, so the heart of our work are community-led projects that bring hot and cold running water and working toilets to people's houses. And in every place we work, it looks a little bit different because it's designed for that place in a participatory process that's led by that community. And that through line of, we call it at work, nothing about them without them. You can see that everywhere in DigDeep. 40% of our almost 80 employees are from communities we serve. 100% of our program directors and managers are from the communities we serve. 44% of us have lived without running water ourselves. So the heart of our work are developing these projects, and sometimes they're off-grid projects that use creative technologies, like they might pull drinking water from the air, or they might deliver drinking water by truck instead of by pipe because it's more efficient, and store it in solar-powered systems at people's houses that pump it through a sink, a shower, and a toilet. In the Texas communities called colonias, where we're working, those are on-grid projects where we blend private funds with often, county, state, and sometimes federal funding to provide all sorts of services at once. It's streets and lights and hydrants and wastewater and water and trash and electricity and broadband. So each project looks a little bit different. The set of partners, the sort of solution set and technology that we use, the approach though is the same. And that's a deep trusting relationship with community because we are that community as an organization.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. Here's what I'd like to do. Could you talk about this this June 28, Closing the Water Access Gap in the United States report? I read through it back when your team shared it with me, and then once again, just to refresh my memory as I prepare for this conversation. Talk about this report. Talk about what are the potential ramifications, what it does for you, for DigDeep, and for raising awareness for this problem, because I would venture to guess 97 out of 100 people listening right now are having their minds blown that we're not talking about water projects in sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about them in states that many of these people live in, like their next door neighbors, a few communities over. So yeah, talk about that report, because I do think it's very important. Again, for those listening, it'll be linked somehow. George will tell me how to do that the best way, but somehow in the show notes for this, because I want you to read it. So we started this work because of Karen's call, right? And as we started that work on the Navajo Nation, and it grew into the Navajo Water Project, which is now massive, we started to get calls from all over the country, asking us, wait, can you come help us? We thought we were the last community in Mississippi or in Alabama or in West Virginia without running water. And we went to the federal government and said, okay, well, what does this problem really look like? Can you give us some census data so that we can map this and figure out how to grow? And all the federal agencies were like, well, we don't keep that data anymore. Wild.
We thought, we got to 99%, and we thought, in 2016, census stopped asking if your house has a flush toilet. A year, in fact, that the number of people without a toilet was going up. So not only is this problem growing, but we have less and less visibility. And so we set out in 2019 to release the first national report on this. And we worked with some incredible organizations. The woman I co-authored with, Radhika Fox, is now the head of water at the Environmental Protection Agency. And it was the first to really look at, okay, how many million, and what are the racial dynamics, and where do these people live, and what are they experiencing? And we went into communities and embedded researchers who were living with and working with people, and we heard stories about how much this impacts people's lives, and especially we heard how much of an economic impact this has. Like, I mean, that's where you really, that's like, money's like the proxy, right, by which you can measure. Most people, especially in the US, can measure sort of what's going on in their lives.
Sure.
And so to give you like an example of what this looks like, we have a client named Brenda who we gave running water to. And I remember first meeting Brenda, actually not long after we started the Navajo Water Project. I showed up to her house on the back of a water truck, and, her family flooded out of the house and they grabbed every drop of water they could take into like cups and buckets and barrels and pickle jars and whatever, saucers. It's like lining every surface of the house. And she took some water in a pot and went inside to make tamales. And I followed her and was helping her cook. And I said, "Oh, this is so nice. Are you having family over? Is there a special occasion?" She said, "No, I'm going to put these tamales in this cooler and put on this license. I'm going to walk down the hill and I'm going to sell them." And that's what I use for gas money. My husband, he works at a factory and he'd been injured, smashed his foot. We couldn't keep it clean at home. So it got infected. It got gangrene. He's in the hospital 50 miles away in Gallup. And actually, he's better. He's been treated. He's been ejected. And now he's sleeping on the streets, has been for a week. And no clean water meant no tamales, and no tamales meant gas money. And no gas money meant I couldn't get my husband. And that meant we haven't had any income. And I'm behind on my bills. And
wild.
And like, these families are living on like this economic cliff. And so at the time when we published that report, we couldn't quantify what that economic impact looked like. Like, what is this costing families? What is this costing the U.S. economy? And if we had that number and could estimate not only what we're losing, but maybe what we stand to gain by closing the gap, we think that would be a really powerful way to motivate lawmakers to change this. Like the money talks. So we released this new report, like you said, on June 28th of this year. It's called Draining: The Economic Impact of America's Hidden Water Crisis. And you can find it at digdeep.org/draining, and I'll give you it for the show notes. And it really looks at, okay, so specifically the U.S. economy is losing almost $9 billion every year that we allow this to continue. And that number will just keep going up as more and more people fall into the gaps. And we know that because we put together the individual numbers. Like, this is causing more than 200,000 new cases of waterborne illness every year. It's causing 36,000 new cases of type 2 diabetes because people have better access to sugary beverages than water. It's causing 71,000 new cases of mental health issues. So to get that big number, you have to piece together all the little numbers, all the little costs that add up on that receipt. And the research tells us that the water access gap is causing 200,000 new cases of waterborne illness every year, and 36,000 new cases of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, from people that have better access to sugar-sweetened beverage than to water, or 71,000 new cases of anxiety and depression. It's costing hundreds of millions of work hours and school hours from adults and children who, have to haul water or are sick from waterborne illness instead of going to school or going to work. It's even causing, deaths, as many as 610 preventable deaths every year. Again, every year this is happening in the U.S., a completely solvable problem. And when you total that all up, it's at least $8.5, maybe $9 billion we're losing every year that we're just sort of bleeding out. And that's what that report is really all about, sort of putting a price tag on this problem and putting a face to it too.
I'm not an incredibly smart person, but hearing those numbers that we are losing $9 billion a year, based on the numbers you already gave me about what it would cost to solve this over the next few decades, like, this thing pays for itself in like 6 years based on what we're losing, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like, this is a no-brainer.
Yeah, that's the good news. I mean, for every dollar we invest, we get $5 back. In 50 years, if we made that, $40-50 billion investment, we could generate $250 billion in return. And I mean, at a time when inflation is so high and we're looking at a potential recession, it's like we're looking for all these opportunities to create economic value. And this is such a huge one that will not only do that, but make people's lives better, and it is save them and correct in many cases historical injustices that go back hundreds of years. So I don't know. It's really powerful. It's profound work. And some people love to stay up in the numbers. I'm more on the storytelling side. I'm more like, tell me what that looks like in someone's life. Like I want to hear about that experience and about what changed when someone got running water. But both are really powerful parts of that narrative.
No, and I was going to the story next, which is, and I'm sure you have 1,000 stories. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, Brenda, was that her name?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, 1,000 stories like Brenda. But think about that. Even up until the moment you told the Brenda story, I'm guessing that most people were thinking about like, oh, a shower, oh, flush the toilet, make some food to feed myself, drink some water to stay hydrated. That's what they're thinking when they think loss of water. No,
Yeah.
Brenda's entire world, her husband's health, gas to get to and from, being able to make the food to sell to make all of that happen. Everything revolved around her getting water. And there are, in those 2.2 million people in our country that need water, there are hundreds of thousands of stories like Brenda's. And so, yes, we can talk numbers. We can also talk stories. Any way you want to go, this is something that we can and should solve. Like, this is a no fucking brainer. Like, water is life. Water is medicine. Water is health. Water is everything. When I was a kid, and I think the numbers still stand up as far as I know, I was always told, like, you can go 3 weeks without food, but you can only go like 3 days max without water. So even as a young kid, I was like, oh my God, like, you mean I could not eat for a long, long time and still be alive? But if I stopped drinking water for a day or two, I could die? Like, that was mind-blowing to me. But, we grow up, and we, especially here in this country, whenever I moved back to the U.S., you just think, look at the wealth. We are home to several hundred of the couple thousand billionaires in the world. We're home to a good number of the billionaires in the world. We are home to just an astronomical, unbelievable, never before in history amount of money. And we have millions of people that don't have water. That's wild to me.
Yeah, Brenda works at a Blimpie sub shop. She lives in New Mexico. You can call her on the phone. This is not some crazy thing happening in the middle of nowhere to a couple people. This is probably happening to someone that lives within walking distance of your house.
Yeah.
Might be a long walk. But you could probably get there.
Yeah. Okay. For 2 minutes, I want you to instill confidence in those listening. If their interest is piqued, most of the people listening, including myself, I've spent several decades now working in the nonprofit space or volunteering in the nonprofit space. And I am fairly tired, worn out, exhausted by the giving and the asks and the this and the that. Only come to find out once I was an adult and I started doing this work and really getting into the weeds to see that so many of these nonprofits, these household name NGOs that we have come to we just know about them. Most of the money that I sent them over the years was not going to the actual work. So I naturally, because I'm not just the host of this podcast, but I am responsible for the thousands of people that look to Let's Give a Damn for stories, for help, for direction. I looked into the numbers, very, very surface level, but I like what I see so far. So why don't you go through, and again, just for a minute or so, explain how this work is funded, what the percentages are, just generally, because I think it will help people. And I'm sure you'll say what I'm thinking, but I want you to go into it first. If you don't, I'll follow up with something. But if people are thinking, I want to give to this. I like George. I like these stories. This is something that is in my backyard that we can solve. Let's go. I want to give to this. Let's give them some confidence that they're giving to something that is worthy of their hard-earned money.
Sure. The first thing I'll say is that is what DigDeep is. It's really sort of a collection of Americans helping Americans, moving those resources around. I think we're mostly grassroots funded. I think, tens of thousands of people give us small gifts every year that we put together and turn into a solar powered home running system on Navajo, or a new water line in Texas, or a new water system in Appalachia. And that's really that's our history, right? That's our backbone. That's how we came to be. So when you're raising money that way, there has to be a lot of transparency and a lot of confidence, because I have to have a couple thousand virtual conversations like that every day and convince people like this is the place to put your $50. And so we made some decisions around transparency at the beginning of the organization, inspired by others like, my friend Scott at Charity Water, or my friends at Liberty North Korea. And we, from the very beginning, raised separate money to cover our overhead and our administrative costs from, a small group of venture philanthropists called our Water Council, from sort of the overhead and operational percentages on grants or on corporate gifts, so that 100% of public donations could go directly to projects. And that is something, even as we've grown into a much larger organization, we've been able to maintain, although, man, there were a couple nail-biting years. And then, we have other financial controls in place too. So we have a platinum seal of transparency from GuideStar and a perfect Encompass score from Charity Navigator. And then also, we try to maintain this 85-15 ratio. So even if that 15% of money that we're investing in overhead, even if not a single dollar of it comes from a public donor, we still try to limit that number. And, it might stretch to over 20% in some years, or go down to 8% in other years, depending on what we're building. Sometimes you have to build the infrastructure, like in HR or in marketing or in legal, and maybe there's an expensive year, but always we try to maintain roughly an 85-15 ratio, and 100% of public funds go directly to water projects. So they don't get commingled in that 15% that goes to overhead at all. The last thing I'll say is, like, transparency is so multifaceted, right? It's about the kind of data you're publishing. It's the kind of standard you're holding to yourself. It's also the way we communicate about our work, because storytelling is so important. So we're transparent not just to our donors, but also to the communities that we're really responsible for. Like, every time we are taking a story to the press, it's not just like CNN or the Washington Post where we're trying to place this. Like, we're trying to place the same story in the Navajo Times and, in rural newspapers in Appalachia and in Texas. And it's like, transparency is something cross-cutting. You have to do it across the board. And so financial transparency is really important. I think it's like, that's how you like ante up in the whole game. You have to do that at least. But if you're serious about it, and I think we are, you can see it in the way an organization functions across the board.
Yeah, I love all of that. So, friends, if you're thinking about giving to what DigDeep is doing, you'll see the breakdown. They share the breakdown of the percentages and what goes to operations, but just you can give with the full knowledge that what you're giving is going to, this incredible work. And probably, not people that maybe, but people that are sharing your same country, maybe your same state, that must have this life-giving water and toilets and things that could change the outcome of their lives. So give with confidence. I'll let you know if I ever am not confident, but so far, very confident in the work that you all are doing. George, as we begin to wrap up, I could keep talking to you for a long time. Maybe we'll do another one at some point. But as we begin to wrap up, you've been so gracious to share so much about your life and how DigDeep came about and the work that you're doing. And I love that little bit on transparency where you are maintaining that level of integrity with the people that you are serving, right? It's, again, I love that last little bit about, like, we're not just trying to, get placements in CNN. Like, we are trying to really partner hand in hand with the people that we are. And you said 44% of the people that work on your staff have experienced, not have, like, that shows me that this transparency that I believe is contributing to your success. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. As we wrap up, though, I want to ask you a couple questions. One is, how are you staying inspired these days? These are really hard days. We are crawling our way out of a pandemic. You are leading a nonprofit that is providing a very vital thing to the world. The work is hard. I worked full-time for nonprofits for 14 years, so I know it. How do you keep going? Is there a person, a book? Is it film? Is it music? Is it reading Chicken Soup for the Soul? Like, what is keeping you inspired? And it could be a variety of those. But like, what are the kinds of things that are keeping you inspired as you continue to do this work in a very tumultuous, weird time in history where there are attempted coups on our government? These midterms are coming up. Like, there's just a lot of everything feels very uneasy. How are you staying inspired? How are you continuing to go forward?
It's all those things you listed. Well, maybe not Chicken Soup from the Soul, but it's almost all those things you listed.
Good.
But I will say two things have been maybe three things have been super important to me. First, the baseline for me is my work. Like this is the place where I feel like in this time of chaos, there is something that like matters and is important. And like you can see and touch and drink and like bathe in this impact. It doesn't feel abstract. And I think that is really grounding and helpful. And it's like, that water's turning on and that person's drinking it and that feels done. And so there's that. But the two things in my personal life, I think I have a daily sort of mindfulness meditation practice. Also, just a hot tip. I really like the daily meditations by this Franciscan named Richard Rohr, who writes from the desert in New Mexico. So check that out.
Yes. I get Father Rohr's emails every single day, and they are vital.
Yeah, really, really helpful. Even if there's something in there that like doesn't really jive with my own spirituality or sensibility, like they really help me think. They incorporate a bunch of other religious traditions too, and I get a lot out of that. So for those of you that are sort of religiously or spiritually minded, hot tip. But I have this friend named Peter, who's an immigrant and a real source of inspiration for me in a lot of ways on my queer journey and on my professional journey. And I noticed that the sort of like, anxiety and depression and like deep sadness that I was feeling at the beginning of the pandemic and with our country's current political situation, like it wasn't impacting him as much. And I turned to him as like, you're one of the most joyful people I know. Like, how are you maintaining this? And he shared a daily gratitude practice with me. He writes down every morning 3 things that he's grateful for, 3 things that'll make his day really great, and then a sort of an intention or a mantra for the day. And then at night, the last thing he does before he goes to bed is he writes down 3 things that he was grateful for throughout the day and 1 thing he learned that day. And I find the formula only takes me about 5 minutes. It's like very doable. And something about writing it down creates this ritual, and you have to think and process, I think, a little more deeply when you put a pen on paper. So I think that's a really important part of it. But I've been doing that every day for about 2 years now, and it's really helped me reframe. And even on tough days, you can sift through your day and find these nuggets that you're like, holy shit, like I had the worst day. And yet, like at 11 o'clock, I had this meeting where like this incredible thing happened and I learned something about myself, and I would have lost it in like the emotional wreckage that was today if I hadn't have taken the time to sift it out. And so that's really meant a lot to me.
I hate you for that last recommendation because I used to be a really big journaler. I have stacks and stacks of journals. I haven't kept barely anything from my. In fact, I got rid of most of everything I owned like 4 or 5 years ago. But I kept these journals because every time I would travel, and I had a daily one as well that I would write almost a page every single day. And it was so impactful for me, not just because I could go back and look, even a year later, what was I feeling during this season of life, and go back and feel, like literally go back to that moment, what I was feeling in real time and feel along with that. But also, so I stopped around the time that I started, when my partner and I started having kids 10 years ago. I started making excuses like, oh, life is really difficult. It's really hard. I don't have time to journal anymore. And I've journaled very infrequently since then. And very is a key word here. Like maybe a week or the equivalent of a week or 2 a year. And I've been trying to get back into it because you're so right that even now, I have multiple organizations that I'm running and more that I'm starting, and all these collaborations and partnerships, and living in New York City with 3 kids and my wife. Like it's a crazy life. But what you just described, a practice that could change the entire outlook on my day or my night, right, as I go to bed, takes 5 minutes. 5 goddamn minutes. If that's generous. It could get done quicker than that. Everybody has 5 minutes. The busiest person on the planet has 5 minutes, and I know you know this, and I'm a walking testament to when I did it consistently. It was life altering because I got to start my day with gratitude, end it with gratitude. What do I hope for the day? Wrap it up with what did I learn? Like better. It's way better than like just doom scrolling on my phone, right, on TikTok or whatever before I shut my eyes.
Yeah, that's the worst thing you could do. I admire you for being a journal guy, because like I couldn't do like an open-end stream of consciousness thing. I need this this assurance that like this will only be 5 minutes. I promise.
Yeah. Well, and I do think to be fair, that was again when I had a lot less going on in life, and now I think I would find the same amount of benefit from just doing this. Like I did the stream of consciousness thing. I have thousands of pages that I've written. I think I could get the same thing from this very short but intentional way of quote unquote journaling. So,
well, I mean, you have a lot of homework. You got a 4 liters challenge to do. You have a new gratitude practice.
I know. You've made this next week a little busy for me. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Last question before we wrap up. Decades from now, you die, and I'm talking many decades from now. But for some odd reason,
maybe
this is a hypothetical. For some odd reason, I have been asked. Sorry, I got distracted there. I'm sitting in a room, and like the lights went on in the other room. Many years from now, I've been asked to give your eulogy. I have been asked to, in front of your friends and family and DigDeep community, eulogize what I assume will be a very impactful life. On that day, in a few sentences, what do you hope would come out of my mouth? This is your eulogy. This is it. Like, this is the summary of your life through those closest to you, whatever. What do you hope that I would say on that day about your life, about your legacy, about the work that you did?
I would hope that you could point to ways that I had loved deeply and authentically and been loved deeply and authentically. I mean, I think that's the beauty of those opportunities. And I think I would hope that you could point to some serious mistakes I'd made and ways I had overcome them or reconciled from them. And I think if you do both of those things and throw in a couple jokes, you'll have a great eulogy.
Done. I mean, that's
the jokes too. You gotta have the jokes.
We'll have the jokes. We'll have the mistakes, but also the victories. That is life. None of us are making just victories. We're making mistakes as well. So that sounds like a life well lived. George McGraw, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for sharing about DigDeep. There are many more things we didn't get to. Again, maybe a round 2 at some point. But thank you so much. I hope that some of the Let's Give a Damn listeners will, at the very least, follow the work that y'all are doing, contribute when they can, but hopefully some will also jump on board on a regular basis to give to this very important work of seeing our actual neighbors get this life-giving water. So thank you very much. So grateful.
Thanks, Nick.
Dam Givers, thank you for showing up. Thank you for spending some time this week with George and me. To find links for everything mentioned in today's conversation and to keep up with all things Let's Give a Damn, visit letsgiveadamn.com. Please share this episode with a friend. Please leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And please show up next week. We have many more incredible conversations coming your way. Chad Snavely, Jess Collins, and the incredible team at Sound On Studios made this episode. The music is by our friend Propaganda, and you can reach out anytime and for any reason at hello@letsgiveadamn.com. I love you all. Be safe. Keep giving a damn. Bye for now.